They didn't invite me for Thanksgiving, not even a text, not a call, nothing at all. 2 days later, though, they sent me an invoice for $31,000. Yes, my own son, the house I bought, the one he's been living in for years without paying a single dime, suddenly came with a price tag, and somehow he expected me to smile, nod, and cover it. At 74, I thought I had seen just about everything, but nothing prepared me for that moment. What I did next didn't involve screaming. I didn't threaten. I didn't plot revenge. I simply reminded myself and them who held the deed and who still had a spine. I folded the cloth napkin carefully, smoothing the corners until it looked nearly perfect. The turkey I roasted was small, just enough for one, dry from the oven, but still warm. Mashed potatoes, cranberry jelly straight from the can, and a single slice of pumpkin pie I'd grabbed from the gas station on my way home. It wasn't much, but it was something. Across the canal, the row house was glowing like a cruise ship. Lanterns hung along the backyard fence, spilling warm light into the night. I could hear laughter carrying across the water, sharp and easy. My grandson was probably running around in that little dinosaur costume he loved so much. Music drifted faintly, glasses clinked, voices rose and fell, the sounds of a family gathering. Except I wasn't part of it. No call, no message. Not even one of those lazy group texts people send when they want to look like they tried. I glanced down at my phone again, the screen bright and empty. The date blinked up at me, November 23rd, Thanksgiving. Last year, I was the one basting the turkey in that very house. The year before that, I hosted it at the community center by the marina, back when I still volunteered on weekends. Before the arthritis made even lifting the coffee pot feel like carrying a brick. But this year, I wasn't even on the list. I took a slow bite of turkey. It tasted like memory. That's the strange thing about getting older. People stop looking at you as someone with stories and start seeing you as someone in the way. I used to run things at the marina, at the house, at PTA meetings, budget committees. Now I was just a name on the tax record and a photo tucked in a drawer no one ever opened. I didn't cry, not really. I just sat there and let the silence fill the spaces where family used to be. Outside the window, I spotted Travis stepping onto the porch with a beer in his hand. He was talking to someone I couldn't see, laughing. That confident kind of laugh he used when he thought no one was listening. I remember when he used to grab my hand before crossing the street. When he'd fall asleep in my arms with peanut butter still on his chin. Now he acted like I didn't exist. Well, not entirely. But that part comes later. That night, after I cleared my plate and wiped down the counter, the lights across the canal finally dimmed. I rinsed my dish and wrapped the leftovers, pressing the four edges down like muscle memory. I stood at the sink, watching condensation collect on the window pane, tiny drops sliding down like slow, quiet tears. For a moment, I thought about calling him, just to say hello, just to ask if maybe they meant to invite me and somehow forgot, but I didn't. Something deep in my bones told me that call wouldn't change a thing. So I switched off the kitchen light and walked into the dark, letting the silence hold me like it was the only family I had left. If you've ever sat alone at a table that used to have your name on it, you know, silence can be the loudest thing of all. Stay with me, though, because this story isn't about bitterness. It's about what happens when a mother stops asking to be remembered and starts remembering herself. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I woke up earlier than usual. I'd slept better than expected, not because I was at peace, but because exhaustion finally caught up with me. The sun crept in slow, painting pale orange stripes across the blinds. I shuffled to the kitchen, made myself a mug of coffee at cheap grounds, but warm and reliable. I had just taken my first sip when my phone buzzed on the counter. It wasn't a call, it was an email. The subject line read, "Row house maintenance costs." For a second, I didn't move. My stomach tightened the way it used to before parent-teacher conferences or middle-of-the-night visits. I tapped it open. It was from Travis. Just seeing his name pop up in my inbox made something shift inside me. It had been months since he'd reached out directly. And when he did, it usually meant something was wrong. For him, not me. I started reading. "Hi, Mom. I hope you're doing okay." He said they'd meant to reach out sooner, but with the holiday rush, things got away from them. He went on to explain that he wanted to share a summary of the recent maintenance costs for the house, since it was still in my name. Attached was the breakdown. My share came to $31,740. "Please review and let us know how you'd like to handle it." I read it again, then again, a third time, just to be sure my eyes weren't lying. No invitation to dinner, no checking on how I spent Thanksgiving, no photo of the kids, no apology for leaving me alone. Just a spreadsheet with numbers and a polite, almost corporate tone, like I was a landlord he barely knew. A PDF was attached. I opened it. Paintwork, plumbing, backyard deck repairs, new appliances. Some of it was reasonable. Some of it I had never even heard about. A full replacement of the master bathroom vanity, new tile work, upgraded fixtures, a wine fridge. It looked less like maintenance and more like renovations meant for a magazine shoot. And somehow, they expected me to cover nearly half. I scrolled down to the very bottom. The total had been rounded neatly to exactly $31,000. Just like that. No warning, no context, no conversation, just a bill. And it wasn't written like a request. It read like a notice. He didn't ask if I could help. He assumed I would, because I always did. That was the thing about Travis. Ever since he was a boy, he knew I would show up. A scraped knee, a broken lease, an overdraft fee, I'd always find a way to fix it. Quietly, gratefully, because I was his mother, and that's what mothers do. But this wasn't a scraped knee. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft dressed up as manners. I closed the email and set my phone face down on the table. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like something vital had slipped away without me noticing. I leaned back in my chair and thought about when we first bought that house. Back when Travis lost his job at the bank, when the market turned, and everything he thought was secure came crashing down. He and Lydia were scared, scrambling to figure out what came next. I offered to help them settle somewhere safe. I told them I'd put my name on the deed, not to control them, but to protect what little security we had left as a family. I never charged them rent. I never asked for repayment. I even helped with the down payment, making it clear that, technically, the house was still mine, just until they could stand on their own. Travis agreed without hesitation. Said it made sense. Back then, I believed him. Now it was obvious he believed something else entirely. He thought I was too old to remember, too soft to push back. That I'd quietly pull out a checkbook out of habit or guilt. But I wasn't too old to remember betrayal. And I wasn't soft enough to pretend I didn't notice. That evening, I didn't reply to his email. Instead, I printed the invoice and pinned it to the corkboard above my writing desk. I sat there staring at the bolded total in black ink until something inside me shifted. For the first time in years, I understood this wasn't about money. It was about erasure. He hadn't invited me to Thanksgiving because I no longer served a purpose. Because I wasn't a source of joy or usefulness anymore. To him, I wasn't his mother. I was a name on a deed. A liability to be handled quietly. That was when the silence inside me began to take a different shape. Not into anger, into decision. And that decision had nothing to do with $31,000. It had everything to do with remembering exactly who I was. The house Travis lived in wasn't just a building. It was a piece of me. I still remember the first time we walked through it together. The walls were painted a tired beige. The carpets were worn flat, and the kitchen tiles had cracks running like tiny rivers across their surface. But Travis had stars in his eyes. Lydia slipped her arm through mine and said they could make it a home, but it would take work. Back then, Travis had just lost his job at the bank. The market had collapsed, and like so many others, he'd been cut loose without warning. Lydia was working at a small hair salon across town, bringing in just enough to cover groceries and gas. They already had a toddler and another baby on the way. I had just retired from my job as operations manager at the marina. I wasn't wealthy, but I had a little saved, enough to help, enough to believe I was doing the right thing. I told them I'd handle the down payment. I offered to put the deed in my name, just to keep things safe. Travis had some unpaid taxes that might complicate financing, and honestly, I knew his history. I never said it out loud, but I always knew he wasn't the best with money. He agreed quickly, maybe too quickly, but I took it as gratitude. The arrangement was simple. They could live there. I wouldn't charge them rent. In return, they'd take care of the place, maintain it, and build their life in it. One day, when things were settled, I'd transfer it to them officially. That was nearly 10 years ago. In the beginning, everything felt right. I'd visit once a week, sometimes twice. I helped them paint the nursery when the second baby came. I brought groceries. I babysat the kids. I drove Lydia to her doctor's appointments when Travis couldn't get away from work. It wasn't always easy, but it felt meaningful. I thought we were building something together, a family, a future, a home stitched out of small acts of love. But little by little, the door began to close. They stopped inviting me over. They started canceling dinner plans at the last minute. Birthdays came and went without me. Travis said they were busy. The kids had school. Lydia's schedule was packed. And somehow, I always understood. I told myself not to intrude. So I stepped back. But even as I gave them space, I kept paying the property taxes quietly every year. I never asked for receipts. I never asked questions. I just assumed they were taking care of the place. I never imagined they were renovating it into something I barely recognized, not until that invoice showed up. That night, I sat at my desk with the printed bill in front of me and pulled out the old folder labeled house. Inside were thick stacks of receipts, tax records, maintenance notes. At the very back was the deed, my name embossed deep into the paper. No one else's. I ran my fingers across the raised seal the way you might trace a name etched on stone. And it hit me. They hadn't just taken over a house. They had rewritten the history of how it became theirs. Not once had Travis mentioned the help I gave. Not once had Lydia said thank you. They lived there as if they had built it from nothing, as if their sweat and savings had carved it into existence. But it wasn't theirs. It was me, all of it. The floors they walked on, the walls they painted, the garden they reshaped, all of it existed because I stepped in when they had nothing. And now, they had the audacity to hand me a bill, as if I'd been freeloading. I leaned back in my chair and let that thought settle deep. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. There was no rage, just clarity. Travis never really wanted a mother. He wanted a cushion, and now that he believed he didn't need one anymore, he treated me as if I were disposable. But he was wrong. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from sadness, from thought. Sharp, focused thought. I walked myself through the past 10 years like I was retracing steps on a long, twisting path. Every dollar I gave, every moment I showed up, every time I swallowed my hurt to keep the peace, I thought about what they took for granted and what I had quietly carried on my own. And somewhere between the memories and the silence, I decided something important. I still had that deed. I still had a voice, and for the first time in a very long while, I intended to use both. I hadn't planned on setting foot near that house again, but sometimes the heart doesn't listen to what the mind decides. 3 days after that invoice arrived, I drove across town. I told myself I only wanted to see the place, just to remind myself it was real, that I hadn't imagined handing them that home, that I hadn't imagined the years of birthdays, barbecues, and late-night calls from Travis when he didn't know how to unclog a sink. It was early afternoon. The sky hung heavy and gray, the kind of winter light that made everything look colder than it was. I parked across the street, under the big elm tree I used to nag Travis to trim every fall. He always said he'd get to it. He never did. The driveway was empty except for Lydia's silver SUV. A wreath hung neatly on the front door, and holiday lights curled along the porch rails. From a distance, it looked festive, normal, inviting, but I knew better now. I stepped out of my car and crossed the street slowly. I wasn't planning to knock. I just wanted to stand there a few minutes, close enough to see what used to be mine. As I reached the sidewalk, I heard voices. Not laughter, not shouting. Just two people talking soft, but not soft enough. The kitchen window was cracked open. Travis and Lydia were inside. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. Travis said my name first. His voice was low, strained. "She's getting older," he said. "I don't think she really understands how expensive this house is to maintain." Then Lydia's voice joined his, smooth and certain. "I mean, it's in her name technically, but we've lived here almost 10 years. We've built a life here. It's basically ours now." "Exactly," Travis said. "She doesn't even come around anymore. If she really cared about us, she'd just sign it over." There was a pause. Then Lydia added, almost casually, "Honestly, she should be grateful we even kept her on the documents. It's not like she pays utilities or anything." They laughed, softly, easily, like I was just some name they were managing on a spreadsheet. Like I was a burden. I stepped back from the window. My feet felt heavy in my shoes. Reading that invoice had stung, but hearing my own child speak of me like that, like I was in the way, like I owed them, there's no dressing that kind of wound. It wasn't just the ingratitude. It was the assumption that I'd give in, that I'd quietly disappear, that I'd hand over the deed and vanish like smoke. I walked back to my car without looking again. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but inside, something closed. It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't spite, it was recognition. In that moment, I understood completely. Travis didn't see me as his mother anymore. He saw me as paperwork waiting to be signed. A transaction to be completed, a problem to be solved. I drove out of that neighborhood for the last time that day. Back at my condo, I opened the cabinet where I keep all the important documents, deeds, tax returns, legal papers. I pulled out the folder marked house and placed it on the table. I went through every page, line by line, slowly, carefully. Receipts, letters, property tax confirmations, all dated and signed. At the very back was the deed. My name was the only one printed there. I ran my finger across the embossed seal, tracing the ridges like I was touching a memory carved in stone. It grounded me. This wasn't just a house. This wasn't about $31,000. This was about respect. I sat there a long while, thinking, not about Travis's words, not about Lydia's laugh, but about what came next. I thought about the years I had stayed quiet, the birthdays I spent waiting by the phone, the dinners I wasn't invited to, the decades of helping, forgiving, and assuming love meant loyalty. And then I thought about the invoice, the conversation I overheard, and the silence they thought I would keep. Not this time. I picked up my phone and called Carol, an old friend from the marina whose daughter was a real estate attorney. I didn't explain everything. I just asked for a name, a number, a starting point. Carol didn't ask questions. She gave me the contact, gently, like she already knew I needed it. That night, I boiled pasta and ate it standing by the kitchen counter. I left the radio on, tuned to an old jazz station from Clearwater. The soft hum of a saxophone filled the quiet space around me. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The next morning, I packed a small overnight bag, 2 sweaters, a pair of shoes, my reading glasses, and a scarf my sister gave me 15 years ago. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. There wasn't anyone to tell. I drove south along the coast, past the little town where I used to work, past the grocery store where everyone once knew my name. The marina sat just beyond the bend, quiet under the winter light. Boats rocked gently in their slips, bobbing with the tide like they were breathing. I parked near the edge and walked down to the farthest pier. The air smelled of salt and old rope. The faint hum of the sea curled into my ears, grounding me the way nothing else could. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, my heartbeat slowed. It had been years since I stood there. I stopped visiting after I retired. The old crew had moved on. Some passed away, others left town. The younger ones didn't remember me, and I didn't blame them. But the sea remembered, and standing there, I remembered, too. I wasn't just someone's mother. I wasn't just a name on a deed. I was a woman who built a career from nothing. I ran daily operations through storms, thefts, budget cuts, and tourist floods. I was the one they called when the harbor lights failed, when shipments were stuck, when the tide threatened the docks. I wasn't always loud, but I was solid. I stood there until the wind turned cold against my face, and for the first time since that email arrived, I felt steady. I walked to a small cafe by the waterfront, the one that used to be a weathered shack, but was now polished and bright. I took a table by the window and ordered coffee and toast. The young waitress called me ma'am with a softness that felt genuine. I opened my notebook and began to write. Not a letter, not a journal. A list. What I own, what I gave, what I sacrificed, what I need, and most importantly, what I will no longer accept. By the third line, my hands stopped trembling. By the fifth, I felt something return. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter. Something stronger. The next morning, I made one more stop before heading home. There was a small law office above a fishing gear shop just off Main Street. The brass plaque outside read, Ashby and Lane Property and Estate Law. I hadn't made an appointment. I didn't need one. Inside, the receptionist offered me tea. I gave her my name and told her I needed to speak to someone about a property matter. 20 minutes later, a man in his early 40s stepped into the lobby. Ms. Rowe, he asked. I nodded. I'm Stephen Ashby. Please, come in. His office smelled faintly of leather and lemon oil. Stacks of neatly labeled folders lined the shelves, everything in sharp order. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and I sat. He asked me how he could help. I told him the basics. That I owned a house my son and his wife were living in. That the deed was in my name. That I had just received an invoice for $31,000. That there was tension, a lot of it. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, his expression calm and steady. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, thinking. Then he asked very simply, Do you want to remove them? The words hung in the air. I sat with them for a moment, letting the weight of the question settle. And then I nodded. Stephen gave one small, deliberate nod back. Then you can, he said softly, and we'll do it legally, respectfully, and in full compliance with Florida property law. He explained what we'd need: documentation, copies of the deed, proof that I'd paid the taxes, formal notices served. I told him I had everything, every receipt, every letter, every record carefully organized and preserved for 10 years. He smiled faintly, almost impressed. Then we'll begin next week. I stood to leave, and he offered his hand. His handshake was firm, but kind. Back in my car, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter, either. I felt ready. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't about punishing Travis or Lydia. It was about reclaiming my space. I had let them live in my home rent-free for almost a decade. I had allowed them comfort while I shrank into silence. I had trusted they'd remember who gave them their start. They hadn't, so now I would remember for them. And I would do it properly, quietly, but unmistakably. 2 weeks passed between my visit to Stephen's office and the day I signed the first set of documents. During that time, I kept my routine almost exactly the same. I watered the potted plants by the window. I took short walks around the block. I fed the neighbor's cat when they were out of town. On the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had shifted. The silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like preparation. Stephen worked efficiently. We spoke only twice after that first meeting. He requested additional paperwork, and I already had it prepared, each page dated, clipped, and in order. He was impressed by my record-keeping, but I didn't explain why. Years of being overlooked had trained me to keep track of everything. On the 14th day, I signed the order for formal notice. We weren't evicting them, not yet. It was the first step toward reasserting ownership. It began with a letter, polite, neutral, legal. It stated that I, as the sole legal title holder, was reviewing the current occupancy agreement. It reminded them there had never been a formal lease, that their stay had been based on family arrangement, not contract, and it requested a meeting to discuss future terms. In short, it made one thing clear. The silence was over. Stephen sent the letter by certified mail, return receipt requested. 2 days later, I got confirmation in my inbox. Lydia had signed for it, and then I waited. 3 days passed. No call, no email, no knock on my door. On the 4th day, a reply finally came, not from Travis, but from a local attorney I didn't know. The letter was short, polite, and signed by Travis himself. It referenced ongoing occupancy and potential ownership implications. Stephen read it calmly, setting the papers down without a flicker of surprise. "They're nervous," he said. Then he slid a fresh sheet of paper toward me. "We'll respond, cordial, direct." Our reply laid out the facts clearly. There had been no lease, no rent paid, no shared property taxes, no documented transfer of ownership. We enclosed a preliminary 90-day notice to vacate, not a threat, a step. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, at the bottom of the page. My hand was steady. That evening, I lit a single candle on the kitchen table. Not for prayer, not for drama, just for stillness. I sat there in the quiet glow, sipping my tea, and realized something I hadn't felt in years. This was the first decision I'd made entirely for me. Not to keep the peace, not to earn forgiveness, not to hold on to family that had already let go, just for me. Somewhere across town, I imagined Travis reading that letter. I pictured Lydia pacing the remodeled kitchen, the one they built on assumptions. I wondered what they were saying, but I didn't dwell on it. Because for the first time, this wasn't about their reaction. It was about reclaiming my right to respond on my terms, in my voice, through channels they couldn't talk over at a family dinner. They had wanted silence. Now they had clarity. And clarity, I was learning, was far more powerful. The first sign that they felt the shift came 2 days later, when someone knocked on my door. It was early afternoon, the sun falling in soft strips through the blinds. I was sitting at the kitchen table, halfway through a crossword puzzle, a mug of mint tea still warm in my hand. The knock was gentle at first, then firmer. I opened the door to find Lydia standing there. Her hands were buried deep in the pockets of a thick beige coat. She looked surprised that I'd answered so quickly, as if she'd hoped I wouldn't. We stared at each other for a long moment. She didn't ask to come in, and I didn't offer. She shifted her weight, glanced at the floor, then straightened her spine. Finally, she met my eyes with a mix of guilt and defiance. "We got your letter," she said. I nodded once. "We didn't expect this from you," she added, her tone sharp but uneasy. I didn't respond, not with words, just with the quiet, steady silence I'd been learning to master. She hesitated, then tried again. After everything, we didn't think you'd go this route, lawyers and all. Still, I said nothing, because what was there to say to someone who had spent years assuming I was too soft to stand my ground? Lydia forced a thin smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Travis is upset," she said. "He feels blindsided." I thought about the decade of unpaid gratitude. The birthdays forgotten, the dinners unreturned, the $31,000 invoice sent without warning. If Travis felt blindsided, It was only because he never believed I had boundaries to cross. Lydia exhaled, trying once more. He thought we were family. At that, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not sadness. Just a deep, still ache. The kind that settles when something you once believed finally breaks for good. I finally spoke. This isn't about punishment, I said evenly. It's about respect and restoring what was lost. Lydia didn't argue. She looked away, nodded faintly, and whispered, "We'll talk to our lawyer." Then she turned and left without another word. I closed the door gently behind her and went back to my tea. A few days later, Stephen called. Travis's attorney wants a mediated meeting, he said. I hesitated, then agreed on one condition. It had to take place at Stephen's office. All communication would go through him. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wanted acknowledgement. When the day arrived, I dressed carefully, navy coat, pressed slacks, a small silver pin my mother once gave me. I didn't dress to impress. I dressed to remember who I was before guilt started shaping my choices. Stephen greeted me at the front desk, his calm presence grounding me. We walked into a conference room where the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. A long oak table stretched across the center, polished to a soft sheen. I sat at one end. Stephen sat beside me. The opposite chairs remained empty for a moment, and I breathed slowly, deliberately. 5 minutes later, the door opened. Travis walked in, followed by his attorney. His tie was loose, his expression tight. He avoided my eyes at first. Lydia wasn't there. We sat in silence while the attorneys exchanged pleasantries, shuffling papers. Then the meeting began. Travis's lawyer opened with soft edges, using words like family, transition, misunderstanding. I listened quietly. My hands stayed folded in my lap. Then Stephen spoke. He laid out the facts one by one, the deed, the taxes, the complete absence of rent or financial contributions, the years of informal occupancy, tolerated only out of family trust. And then he stated our position clearly. There would be no eviction yet. I wasn't throwing anyone out onto the street, but the house would be sold within 6 months. The proceeds would not go to Travis or Lydia. They had made no investment, paid no tax, and contributed no equity. Their occupancy had been conditional, and that condition had ended. Silence filled the room. Travis shifted in his chair, jaw tight, hands clenched. Finally, he spoke. "We thought you were done with all that real estate money," he said. His voice clipped. "You've been alone for years. We assumed you didn't care." That word, assumed, landed heavier than he probably realized. I let the pause stretch, letting his words settle in the quiet space between us. Then I said softly, evenly, "I may be alone, but that doesn't mean I'm invisible." Stephen glanced at me, then back at Travis, letting the silence do the work. For the first time in years, my son finally looked at me, not like his mother, not like a source of money, just like a person sitting across the table, holding her ground. I saw something flicker in his face, not regret exactly, but recognition. The meeting ended without a handshake. I stood, gathered my papers, and walked out into the cold, gray air. My breath came easy. There was no elation, no triumph, just relief. For years, I had swallowed my voice to keep the peace. And now I had spoken, without shouting, without begging, and they had heard me. The sale of the house didn't happen overnight. Real estate never moves as fast as feelings. But once the agreement was signed, the path ahead became clear. A closing date was set for 6 months out. From that moment on, everything shifted into a quieter rhythm. Travis and Lydia didn't reach out again, not directly. All communication went through their lawyer. Stephen kept me informed with quiet, efficient updates. There were no dramatics, no pleading, just two people coming to terms with the fact that something they thought was permanent no longer belonged to them. In those weeks, I slipped back into a routine that felt more like mine than anything had in years. I started walking to the bakery 2 blocks over, where the young man behind the counter always asked if I wanted extra cinnamon on the foam of my latte. I replanted my little balcony garden, mint, basil, a pot of lavender that made the whole place smell like summer. I subscribed to a literary magazine from Maine, essays by women over 60. Each piece felt like a letter from a friend I hadn't met yet. One morning, while organizing the hallway closet, I found an old cardboard box I hadn't touched in years. My handwriting stretched across the top in faded marker. Travis. I carried it to the table, sat down, and opened the flaps. Inside were photo albums, school play programs, drawings done in crayon, a rock painted like a turtle, a Mother's Day card from 2nd grade that still smelled faintly of glue. There were letters, too, camp notes, scribbles on the back of grocery lists, and one folded page with uneven pencil marks that said, "Don't be sad." He had written it after his father left. I took my time with that box. Every item held a memory, but not all of them hurt. Some made me smile. Some reminded me of when love was simple, when being his mother didn't require strategy or second-guessing. I didn't cry. What I felt was something gentler than grief, but heavier than nostalgia. It was proof that I had tried, that I had been there, that I hadn't imagined those years when he needed me, and somewhere in the middle of those scraps of childhood, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer needed him to admit he took me for granted, because I no longer doubted what I had given. That afternoon, I packed most of the items back into the box, but I kept a few. A photo of us at the beach in Sarasota, his hair tangled from the wind, my arm around his shoulder like I still believed I could protect him from everything. I placed it in a small silver frame and set it on my nightstand, not as a shrine to sadness, but as a record, a witness. A chapter one wrote with both hands and a full heart. In the following weeks, I met with Stephen twice more. We finalized the disclosures, confirmed the timeline, prepared everything for closing. Each signature I penned felt like a quiet reclaiming, not revenge, resolution. The final check from the sale was sent by certified mail. When it arrived, I didn't open it right away. I left the envelope on the kitchen counter for most of the afternoon, not out of fear, but because I wanted to be present for the moment I finally received it. When I finally slid it open, the numbers didn't surprise me, but the feeling did. There was no triumph, no bitterness, just space. Space to breathe, space to choose, space to rebuild something in the quiet image of my own voice. That evening, I sat at the table with my notebook again. But this time, my list looked different. What I kept, what I released, what I learned, what I am no longer afraid of, what I will create next. I didn't write his name this time, because for the first time in a very long while, the story wasn't about what Travis thought of me. It was about what I thought of myself, and I liked the way the story was turning. The day of the closing came on a Tuesday morning, bright and windless. Florida sometimes gifts you those winter days, all soft light and quiet promise. I dressed simply, navy slacks, a pressed blouse, nothing flashy, nothing to prove. Stephen met me at the title office. The air smelled faintly of fresh paper and coffee. Stacks of documents were laid neatly on the table, clipped and labeled in careful order. I placed my hand on the top page for a moment before picking up the pen. Signing didn't take long. Name, date, initial, repeat. Halfway through, I paused, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment I officially let go, not just of the house, but of the story they told themselves about me. For years, they assumed I'd stay quiet, that I'd forgive endlessly, that I'd choose being forgotten over making waves. But now, they had no more space to rewrite my narrative. When the papers were signed and notarized, Stephen slid an envelope across the table. Inside was the check, larger than expected, thanks to a competitive market and a last-minute bidding war. I looked at the number, nodded once, and tucked it into my bag without a word. Stephen smiled gently. "You did this the right way," he said. I didn't respond, but I knew he was right. On my way out, I passed Travis and Lydia in the hallway. They weren't there for the meeting. They weren't supposed to be there at all. But there they stood, arms crossed, eyes tight, caught somewhere between pride and something unspoken. Lydia looked away first. Travis held my gaze a moment longer. There was no apology, no anger. Just a strange, hollow silence, the kind that lingers when a door has been shut too many times. I gave them a polite nod and walked past without slowing down. Later that day, I drove back to the marina. I hadn't been there since all this began. The boats still rocked gently in their slips, the breeze carrying salt and memory in equal measure. I walked to the farthest edge of the dock, where the water stretched wide and endless. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast, but instead of fear, I felt calm. In my pocket, I had the folded closing statement. I took it out, looked at it once more, then folded it back carefully, and let the wind brush against its edges. That evening, I hosted dinner for 2 women from my book club. We sat around my small table, laughing over overcooked chicken and an under-seasoned salad. At some point, one of them asked how my week had been. I smiled and said, I finished something that needed finishing. Nothing more, no saga, no bitterness. Because that was the truth of it. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about closing the door to a room I no longer belonged in and locking it behind me. Not to shut anyone out, but to protect what was still mine. A few days after the closing, a thin envelope arrived in the mail. Not from an attorney this time, from Travis. I hesitated before opening it, my fingertips tracing the crease in the paper. Inside was a single sheet. His handwriting was rushed, uneven, like he hadn't wanted to sit with the words too long. It didn't say much. He acknowledged the sale, said they were looking for a smaller place, mentioned that Lydia had picked up extra shifts at the salon. Then, at the very end, there was a single line, I didn't think you'd go through with it. I sat there staring at those 6 words for a long while. Not because they hurt, because they revealed everything. They had counted on my silence. They had counted on my softness. They had counted on my love being stronger than my sense of self. For years, they were right, but not anymore. This time, love didn't mean sacrifice. Love meant drawing a line. Love meant saying, enough. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the back of a drawer, placing it next to the box of old photos and drawings I'd kept. Not as a keepsake, not as a wound, but as a marker, a reminder of the day I stopped waiting for someone else to see me and chose to see myself. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, a soft rustle against the quiet evening. It sounded almost like applause. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not waiting for an apology that may never come, not chasing approval I no longer needed. Just standing on the other side of a line I drew myself, steady, unshaken, and whole. The weeks that followed passed quietly. No unexpected calls, no more letters, no surprise visits. It was as if something that had been wound tight for years finally loosened and released into the air. I had stepped out of an old rhythm and into something new. Something softer, something mine. Each day became its own small ceremony. I woke before the sun, brewed a single cup of coffee, and opened the windows wide. I let the cool air drift in, carrying the reminder that this space, this life, belonged to me again. Not just the apartment, not just the time, but the quiet dignity of deciding, for once, how I wanted to live. One morning, I walked to the senior learning center I'd read about in a community flyer. It was just a few blocks away, tucked near a quiet park. The building was small, beige, simple, inside. A woman named Sandra greeted me with a warm smile and a stack of brochures. She walked me through the classes. Digital skills, local history, photography with your phone. And one title made me pause, storytelling for radio. Sandra explained it was taught by a woman who used to work at an NPR affiliate. I signed up without thinking too hard. It had been years since I sat in a classroom, but when I walked into that room on the first day, something inside me stirred awake. Maria, the instructor, welcomed us like we were old friends. The other women, silver-haired, soft-spoken, open-hearted, made room for me without hesitation. We started small, sharing fragments of our lives. A tornado in '73. A high school sweetheart lost too soon. A first child born too early. No judgment. No fixing. Just the simple act of being heard. When it was my turn, I didn't tell them everything. I talked about the marina. About the box of childhood drawings. About the kind of silence that grows so thick you almost forget what your own voice sounds like. I didn't need to say Travis's name. The room understood. After class, Maria pulled me aside. She said I had a cadence to my voice, the kind that makes people lean in. She asked if I'd ever considered sharing parts of my story publicly. I smiled and shook my head, but later that night, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and thought about it. Maybe not now, but maybe soon. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down. I didn't open my notebook to make another list this time. I opened it to write the first lines of something new. Not a journal, not a reckoning, just a small piece of truth, told in my own rhythm. It began with an image of a woman standing alone on a pier, the wind pulling gently at her coat, and something inside her finally still. That was how I felt now. Still, not passive. Still like an old tree with roots sunk deep into the earth, branches open to the sky. Storms would come, but I no longer feared the wind. In the afternoons, I started walking to the lake nearby. I'd sit on a bench by the edge of the water and watch the geese drift lazily across the surface. Sometimes I brought a book. Other times, I just sat and watched the light change, letting the silence settle comfortably around me. It was different now. Silence didn't ache anymore. It held me. It made room for me. I began to notice the small, steady ways life stitched itself back together. Mr. Dellis from down the hall started leaving his extra newspaper by my door each morning. The woman in apartment 5B began waving from her balcony whenever she saw me outside. These were small things, but they added up. Life didn't have to be big to be full. One Saturday morning, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a postcard. The picture showed a small lake surrounded by cypress trees. No message, just a single signature at the bottom. Travis. I stared at it for a long time, trying to read the silence between the lines. Regret, maybe. Nostalgia, maybe. Or maybe just a gesture to remind me he existed, and that, in some way, I still did too. I didn't respond, not out of anger, but because I didn't need to anymore. I placed the postcard in the same drawer where I'd kept his letter. Not hidden, not forgotten, just stored away, like a chapter I'd already read. And that, I realized, was its own kind of freedom. As the months passed, I felt something quiet and strong settle deeper into my bones. This wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about reclaiming myself. The right to take up space, the right to change my mind, the right to say no without apology, and maybe most importantly, the right to stop explaining why I no longer wished things had turned out differently. That wish had faded like an old bruise. Because the truth is, I acted when I was ready. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Now, every quiet morning I woke to sunlight spilling across my kitchen table. I knew I had chosen well. Spring arrived slowly, in soft waves. The trees outside my building unfurled pale green leaves, one fragile curl at a time. I began spending more mornings on the balcony with the windows open, letting the breeze move through my apartment and carry away whatever remnants of old grief still clung to the corners. I wasn't healing fast, I was healing right. The class at the senior center became a small anchor in my weeks. Every Wednesday afternoon, I walked the few blocks to the beige building by the park. Inside, Maria always greeted us with the same warm smile, her bracelets chiming softly when she waved. The group had grown comfortable together. By then, we weren't just strangers sharing stories. We had begun carrying little pieces of each other's lives. One woman spoke about losing her husband after 52 years of marriage. Another told us how she'd raised 3 boys on her own while working 2 jobs. Each story was different, but the weight behind them was the same. Years of showing up for everyone else, and finally, the quiet discovery of showing up for ourselves. When it was my turn, I started small. I talked about the marina, about the nights the tide rose higher than the docks, and how we scrambled to tie down boats before the storm winds tore them loose. I spoke about the salt air, the ropes that frayed too quickly, and the way the sea always seemed to hold secrets no one could name. Maria listened closely, nodding along, and when I finished she said, "You have a voice people lean into without realizing it. You should think about sharing more." I laughed it off at first, but later, at home, her words echoed back to me. A few weeks later, Maria invited me to contribute a short segment for the community radio hour. Nothing fancy, she said, just 5 minutes. Something true. I thought about saying no. Then I thought about the silence I had lived in for years, and I said yes. I chose a story from when I was 9 years old, The first time my father took me sailing, I remembered the way the wind filled the sail, tilting the boat just enough to make my stomach flip, and how he laughed when I gripped the side too tightly. I remembered how, for the first time, I felt the size of the world stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. On the day the piece aired, I sat alone on the couch with the lights off and the windows cracked open. The soft hum of my voice came through the little radio speaker, steady and unshaken. For a moment, the sound filled the room, layered over the distant rustle of palm fronds outside. I listened all the way through. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It was just true. And hearing my own voice carry something real into the world, the voice I thought had been silenced years ago, felt like setting something free. The next class, Maria handed me a small envelope with my name on it. Inside was a handwritten note from a stranger who'd heard the broadcast. It was only one line. "Thank you for saying what I've never been able to say." I sat there with the note in my lap for a long time, letting the weight of those words settle. I had spent years believing I'd become invisible. And yet, in that small moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in decades. Not because of Travis, not because of Lydia, not because of who I was to anyone else, but because of what I was choosing to be for myself now. That night, I wrote again in my notebook, not a list this time, but the first page of something I wasn't ready to name yet. It wasn't for publication. It wasn't to prove anything. It was just for me. A reminder that my voice belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was just here, at my kitchen table, pen in hand, writing myself back into my own story. Summer arrived quietly that year, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with longer days and warm evenings that stretched themselves softly across the horizon. By then, I had found a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. I woke when the sunlight touched the curtains, slow and unhurried. I brewed a single cup of coffee and sipped it by the open window, letting the early breeze move gently through the room. I took long walks with no destination in mind. I started cooking again, small meals, plated carefully, as if nourishing myself had finally become reason enough. There were moments when I thought of Travis, but they no longer carried weight. They came and went like passing clouds, acknowledged, then gone. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. No postcards, no letters. No updates from neighbors, and that was okay. Because the silence wasn't emptiness anymore, it was space. Space I had reclaimed. Space I had filled with myself. One Saturday, I opened my mailbox and found another postcard. This one showed a stretch of desert under a dusky sky, the rocks glowing red against fading light. On the back, 5 simple words. "Hope you're doing well, Travis." I traced the letters with my thumb for a moment, then placed the card gently into the same drawer where the others rested. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Forgiveness doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes, it's just choosing not to carry the weight anymore. In time, I came to understand that letting go wasn't abandoning love. It was choosing to love myself enough to stop bleeding for someone who couldn't see the wound. I wasn't erasing the past. I was rewriting what came next. At the senior center, I kept attending Maria's class, and little by little, my notebook began to fill. Fragments of memory, quiet pieces of truth, new beginnings stitched between old scars. I stopped writing for anyone else's approval and started writing to hear my own voice clearly again. I had stopped waiting for the family I once imagined. I had built something else instead, something steadier, softer, entirely mine. One afternoon, sitting on my balcony, I looked out over the street lined with blooming jacarandas, the purple petals scattered across the pavement like tiny pieces of something finished but still beautiful. I thought about everything that had happened, the silence, the letters, the house, the choice to finally draw a line. And I smiled, just slightly, because the ending wasn't the loss. The ending was finding myself again, at the top of a fresh page in my notebook. I wrote 5 simple words. I owe myself this chapter. And this time, I meant it. Not as a declaration, not as defiance, but as truth. I had arrived here, not by accident, but by finally choosing to stop shrinking, to stop apologizing, and to stop waiting on the doorstep of someone else's comfort. That was the real victory. Not the check, not the closing, not even the silence. The victory was becoming the kind of woman who no longer begged to be seen, but who saw herself fully and chose herself anyway. And in that ending, there was something quiet and rare, a beginning. If you've ever felt like you gave too much and were left with too little, I hope this reminds you of the quiet strength you still hold. Sometimes choosing peace means choosing distance, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is walk away steady, unshaken, and whole.